Hi, I'm Valerie, and this is my reading wrap-up for November of 2020. I read 3 books during the month of November: David Sedaris' The Best of Me, The Tipping Point by Malcolm Gladwell, and The Nightingale by Hanna, Kristen. So let's jump in. The first book I read was David Sedaris' The Best of Me, and I love David Sedaris. So even though this book is not new, it, as the title implies, is a compilation of what he considers to be his best work. And to be honest, not all of it is what I consider to be his best work, but that's subjective entirely. And he's the author, so I defer to him. There's really a quality to David Sedaris' writing which makes you feel like, especially, or maybe because of the exposure of moments and qualities that you wouldn't necessarily expect someone to put forth. Those sort of references to his baser qualities that sort of endear you further to him. It makes you feel like he must consider you a close friend because, after all, you know his family, and would he trust you with all these details if he didn't consider you a close friend and a trusted confidant? So, as I said, I loved this book. I listened to the audiobook, and as always, the chance to hear his thoughts in his own words was really great. 5 stars, would recommend, and it was definitely, for me, a light in 2020's darkness. The next book that I read was by Malcolm Gladwell, and it's called The Tipping Point: How Little Things Can Make a Big Difference. So in this book, Malcolm Gladwell sort of tackles the topic of how an impulse, a product, a disease, a fashion becomes a movement. A product becomes a hot in-demand item. A disease becomes an epidemic, and a fashion becomes a trend. So the rules surrounding it, the folks who are instrumental in making it, connectors, mavens, and salesmen, and a whole host of other topics. And I could spend a really long time talking about this, and I'm going to try not to do that, and instead just kind of give you a taste of what really resonated for me, and maybe that'll inspire you to seek out this book as well. There's lots of cool case studies within here that give you sort of understanding of the precepts and the ideas that he's isolated that create the tipping point. So one of the really interesting ones for me was about stickiness, because I work in the adult learning field. And so the concept of stickiness is really important in terms of like retention, but also translation. We call it learning transfer. So when you take something from theory or idea and then someone makes it applicable in their life, they do something different or better as a result of some form of information or education that you present to them. So the concept of stickiness is talked about in the book, that a message makes an impact and you can't get it out of your head, and then that further drives you into action. And that is sort of described in the context of how that stickiness played a part in the success of Sesame Street and Blue's Clues, which were innovators, each in their own right, for children's programming and education. It talked about the things that I kind of gleaned and took notes on to apply to my own professional life and to this YouTube channel, is how practical and personal pieces of advice are more memorable, how important clarity is, how segments or chunks of learning shouldn't go beyond 4 minutes, and that's where I'm paying attention to the time as I speak, and that 3 minutes is probably optimal, that you should limit the number of words you're using there's a concept called perceptual span. So when we read, we're capable of taking in only about one key word and then 4 characters to the left and 15 characters to the right at any one time. So if you're throwing words up on a screen, if you're doing a video or a PowerPoint presentation, and that your words should be towards the center of the screen, because when people are viewing a screen, their eye movement research tends to demonstrate that people tend to fixate on the center of the screen. In terms of retention and understanding, story is central. Try to tell the story visually. The more engaged we are in watching something intellectually and physically, the more memorable and meaningful it becomes. So using things like physical triggers, like if you've ever listened to a speech or given a speech where they ask you to raise your hand if you've ever been part of a presentation where they asked you to raise your hand. That makes it more memorable and more meaningful because the person is participating. Also using the technique of asking questions. So I want to ask you to think back to a time where you were asked either a rhetorical or a specific question, and does that spring to mind, that memory spring to mind? Because that's a tool of retention as well. Also the technique of explicitly asking for participation. People are interested in being intellectually active when they watch something, and they want to be given the opportunity to be behaviorally active as well. So what that means in translation is, if you're going to do a YouTube video or you're going to do a presentation or you're trying to educate someone, ask for their help and pause. So talk directly to the camera so the person feels like they're talking to you, and enlist their help. I'm going to do this right here. So if you can think of a time or you have an example, I'd love to hear it in the comments below. And if you like this video, click like. If you really like it, feel free to share it with someone else, and subscribe and hit the bell. And that'll help my channel, and we'll have participated with one another. So something also interesting that I gleaned from the book is that repetition works. If you're doing something episodic, don't feel like you have to create something completely new and completely novel each time. There's definitely a saturation point, especially with adult learners. But keep in mind that there is some degree of repetition that people look forward to because they like the callback. If you created good experiences, then there's almost a sense of nostalgia that can set in. Repetition doesn't have to be boring, because each time somebody watches something episodic, they're experiencing it in a different way. And especially for younger kids, there's a seeking for understanding and predictability. And that is really affirming for people and actually helps with their sense of self-worth. And I know as I was reading about this, I was thinking about some of my favorite YouTube creators and how I like some of the formulaic nature of their videos, and I can be a little disappointed sometimes when they don't follow those formulas and those things that I'm used to. So this definitely resonated with me. Definitely as people get older, they are looking for novelty, and I'm not suggesting that you just blanketly repeat things, but some repetition, again, can be really good. Also, if you're doing episodic content or learning content in particular, think about starting content out easy to give the viewer confidence, and then get progressively harder, challenging them and drawing them into the narrative as time goes on. And one of the themes that was really here was about tinkering, to going with trial and error as your approach, and just kind of play with the presentation of ideas until you find out what works best for your audience. So as I said, I'm a learning professional, so these were all really interesting to me, and I like to hear kind of the evolution of these famous programs and what methods they use to determine success, because that's something I'm always seeking as well. So in brief, too late. Tipping points are exciting because they affirm the potential for change and the power of intelligent action. So if it wasn't apparent, I thought this book was really interesting and worth a read. My last book that I read for November was The Nightingale by Hanna, Kristen. And this one's going to be shorter because I didn't like it, which puts me in the gross minority, as the Goodreads community, with few exceptions, swooned over this book. My book club, for the most part, swooned over this book. This was a book selection from a member of my book club for the month. So just a few of my reasons. I don't want to belabor the point. I don't like to pick on books too much, but I didn't really like any of the characters. Number two, every stereotypical cliche World War II thing happens in this itty bitty village and happens all at once. I feel like most of this book would fail the Bechdel test. It was all about love and dependence on men, constant descriptions of clothes, focus on beauty, just a fairly unfeminist book. And sloppy writing, I feel like, to boot, aside from the cliches, which I found to be not great. Sloppy attention to detail. And then finally, I'll just say the context for this story is that it's supposed to be inspired by a French resistance fighter, André Dijon, which I may be pronouncing that incorrectly. Only they took, I feel like, a lot of the attributes of that heroine and almost like Americanized her, made her blonde, made her pretty, and cheapened sort of her role in history by really focusing on her moping around about love, made that like the driving force, romantic love, the driving force in the story, which I felt like discredited the actual heroine. Have you read any of these three? Do we share recommendations, stars, opinions? I'd love to hear from you in the comments. If you liked this, give it a like on YouTube. Feel free to subscribe if you wanna.